Good evening, and welcome to our event. My name is John O'Sullivan, and I'm the president of the Danube Institute, and it's a pleasure to have you here this evening at the Villa for what I know will be a fascinating evening, a step back into a world that feels in some ways very distant and in other ways surprisingly familiar, particularly in recent days. Our subject is Nicholas Roosevelt, a name that does not perhaps first have the ring of history about it, at least not compared to his two well-known cousins, Theodore and Franklin. Yet he lived through, and he contributed to some of the great dramas of the 20th century. The bitter and fascinating American presidential election of 1912, the diplomacy leading up to the First World War, the economic storms of the Great Depression, the ideological conflicts of the Second World War, an element of the colonial history of that period, vis-à-vis the Philippines, and the early chill of the Cold War. His journey through journalism, diplomacy, and public service is brought to life in a new book by Dr. Zoltán Peterec, and we're very proud to be part of its launch tonight. Thank you very much for writing it and for being here. And we're joined by an impressive panel. First, the author himself, Associate Professor of English and American Studies at Esterházy Karolyi University in Eger. Alongside him, Dr. Balint Ablonczy, the Associate Professor at Versh-Lorand University and a Senior Research Fellow at the Hunren Research Center for the Humanities. And of course, the last occasion you were here, you were introducing your own book, and as I remember well, that led to a fascinating debate and argument. And the next member of the panel is Dr. Tibor Glant, Associate Professor at the University of Debrecen and Research Professor at the John Lukács Institute for Strategy and Politics. Not present, to our regret, but represented here today is Katalin Kádor-Lin, a Hungarian-American historian herself and the proprietress of the Helena History Press. She can't be with us, and representing her is her colleague, Gergely Tamás, Mr. Tamás, who will be selling books during the reception, and also has kindly provided us with the wine, which we will all be enjoying at the time. Excuse me. Just a word, a moment, on Dr. Lin. She's done a remarkable service in bringing into English many key works on 20th century Hungary, works that the wider world badly needs to read if it is to understand the fateful events of both the 20s, well, from the 20s really, to the 1990s. This book is part of that broader effort, helping to make the history of modern Hungary more visible and more widely understood. Perhaps more visible is not right, perhaps it should be more audible in other languages. And this study of Nicholas Roosevelt serves that purpose by shedding light on a vital period of American engagement with Central Europe and offering fresh insights into the forces that shaped the modern world. On that note, I will turn to our distinguished panel to guide us through these themes in greater depth. I'll do what I can when they've each has spoken, and I will encourage them to quarrel with each other and to take questions from you, the audience. In the meantime, let me begin by asking the author, Dr. Peterec, to open with some remarks about his book.
Thank you very much. I would like to welcome everyone here, my fellow panelists, and I would like to also thank Katalin, who cannot be here, and her unwavering support to bring this book to fruition. And my family, who's always here. Without their support, I wouldn't be here, and this book and the other books wouldn't have been created. So our topic is here, Nicholas Roosevelt, whose family name is familiar to everyone, I'm sure, in this room and out of this room. His bad fortune was to be sandwiched between two giants, that is Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. Though his ambition lived up to those two people, his career was shadowed, I could say overshadowed by those presidents. But since he came from the fold of Theodore Roosevelt, because Nicholas Roosevelt's father died when he was 3 years old, and basically Theodore Roosevelt brought him up. He belonged to that family because Nicholas's father and Theodore Roosevelt were cousins, first cousins. So he basically belonged to that household, and he got instilled in him that kind of progressive, conservative ideas or ideals that Theodore Roosevelt was famous for, and that's what he preached all throughout his life. He was a very smart, very well-educated man, a Harvard graduate, and he was, through diplomacy, journalism, government service, as we heard, he had this curse of thinking being too smart, and he shared his ideas with whomever was willing to listen, and he was frustrated because I think he couldn't reach higher pinnacles of his career, and his advice was not taken into larger account. He thought that more was due to him, and unfortunately for us, at least for me as a researcher, his career was cut short for health reasons at the end of World War II. Then he had to retire, so then he wasn't very active, but thank God he was active in writing and publishing, so he wrote like a dozen books or so throughout his career, and some of them after his retirement in 1946, especially his memoirs, which contains a lot of interesting information about these decades, starting with basically the 1912 presidential election, which was his rites of passage in many ways, politically at least concerning American domestic policy. And then World War I, he was thrust into the thick of diplomacy, and right after the post-war period, again, he traveled widely in Europe, in and out of Europe, and then Southeast Asia, the Philippines in particular, and became a relatively household name in the United States. Not, I wouldn't say famous, but in certain circles, his name just rang well. He was a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and wrote many pieces, foreign affairs and other well-known dailies or magazines of the day. And this book basically tries to provide a biography of his many decades. He lived a long life. He died only in 1982. And his insight into many of the issues of the day or the decades that he went through, starting with, again, the very early 1910s, whether it's American domestic or foreign policy, and all throughout the very early 50s, I think lets us an insight into a certain group of Americans who were active in the world. So they did not represent perhaps that large mass that we typically think of isolationists. He understood foreign policy in particular very well, and he had certain ideas what the American interests were in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and beyond, and he was never shy to express them, whether in certain reports to the State Department or private letters or his own diaries, which is typically a well of very interesting, sometimes fascinating, sometimes ideas that puts you ashamed, but that's how we are. And why he's interesting, because many of the things that he wrote throughout the 1910s, 20s, 30s, and so on wouldn't be, publishable today to a large degree, but through the lens of a historian, we can still read them and either enjoy them or criticize them to a large degree. Both can be deserved. Hopefully, my fellow panelists who had a chance already to read the book will bring up some questions or some topics to discuss, and that will be hopefully to the enrichment for everyone sitting here, and hopefully we will get questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll go straight on to Professor Oblonsky.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very honored. Zoltan's book is a very fascinating one. Useless to say, of course, all of his books are fascinating, but which is important in this regard, that Hungarian historians, not all of them, of course, are committing often a fault in a way that writing about a foreign intellectual, they are searching for the Hungarian connection, and they are writing about the famous man and Hungary, which is important. It's a very good thing, but I think it's tend to be sometimes a little bit provincial or very ill-focused in this regard. And of course, this biography, which is in the same time, I think, an intellectual biography or a work of intellectual history, not focusing on Nicholas Roosevelt's relation to Hungary. Of course, there is multiple quotes and multiple chapters on it, but offers a whole panorama of an American intellectual in the first half of the 20th century. So, of course, what is necessary for this kind of approach? A huge amount of archival material, which is often it's hard to access from Hungary, but of course, and that's my question as well, how many archives or American or European archives were you been to write his book? And however, when we take the Hungarian focus for this book, the Hungarian chapters, I learned a lot about the relation between the United States and the Philippines, for example, which I was not a specialist of this topic, but taking the Hungarian point of view, taking this provincial approach, it was very interesting, the views that the ambassador or the Mr. Roosevelt had on the Hungarian political elite, the Hungarian cultural elite, and on the Hungarian society of the 30s when he was in Budapest. And it is very strange that the same kind of reaction we can find among a certain amount of French diplomats, for example. I remember that he had a quote writing about the Hungarian peasants. They are like Russians, they are like serfs in Russia, or there is no great difference between the serfs in Russia and the Hungarian peasants. We have the exact same words for Louis de Robien, who was chargé d'affaires at the beginning of in the first half of the 20s, in his unpublished memoirs about his staying in Hungary. We can find the exact same words about the similarity between Hungarians and Russians, and englobing this whole idea of Eastern Europeans are all the same. In a way. So that was, in a way, fascinating. And it was interesting, for example, Pál Teleki has been the smartest man in Hungary and so on. So he was quite, he had a relatively good opinion on Pál Teleki. His successor, Montgomery, sent by the Democrat administration, had a very good opinion about Horthy, about the whole political elite, but he had a relatively bad opinion about Teleki in the same time. So this kind of intellectual stature of the Hungarian politicians are very different in different American ambassadors' mind. So just a few words to introduce this very good but very well-written book, and you can find in the appendix a lot of unpublished writings of Nicholas Roosevelt about Hungary, but not only on Hungary, about the Philippines and other topics.
Thank you. Before I move on to Professor Glant, can I just suggest that, first of all, it is a beautifully written book, very readable, and judgments well expressed. It occurred to me that you might compare him to writers like Horace Walpole in the 18th and early 19th centuries, or Harold Nicholson, who was the diarist in the Versailles Conference, went on, of course, to his diaries take us right the way through to the 50s. And even the Conservative Member of Parliament, Chips Channon, who did some wonderful diaries from really the 20s in England and onwards. And now recently, we've had published in England, well, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, the diaries of, in the 1930s of the Russian ambassador. I'm afraid his name has just escaped me. But I wonder, would you say that in some ways, writers like that are as important to history as almost any other witness, because they take us across a wide range of wide social range, and of course they do so with I think with not only the ability to produce lovely pen portraits, but with a lot of wise sayings. I mean, Horace Walpole's most famous remark is, this world is a comedy to those who think and a tragedy to those who feel. And in a way, what you get in writers like this is both feeling and thinking about that society and making it live again for us. Right.
Okay, just a comment or two on what you said, and thanks for your words. Yes, intellectual history, I think it must be, when you study such a person, it has to be first and foremost intellectual history, not diplomatic history, though there are chapters, of course, concerning in this field as well. And I think what you just mentioned about this French monsieur, I think it's not very surprising. I think we learned from Larry Wolff this idea that these people from the West brought with themselves that, beyond Vienna, there was a strange, unknown, semi-feudal or primitive, barbaric mass called Eastern Europe. And I think they approached the people living here through that prism or through that lens, and they never could really break out of that, self-made cell, intellectual at least. Maybe there were exceptions, but exceptions to the rule. So whether it was, the magnates or the aristocrats or just the peasants, whatever, I think Nicholas Roosevelt and other Americans or French or British people judged those people accordingly, and they couldn't escape it. A note on the sources, because you mentioned the sources. So when you want to tackle such a difficult task as a person who is not, very well known, not very famous, like the other Roosevelt, just to give this very good example, you have to go to multiple places, multiple archives to find the right sources. In the case of Nicholas Roosevelt, of course, first you go to the Hungarian archives because they are here. Then you have to go to Washington, D.C. There's the National Archives. You have to go to the National Archives of the UK, and there is a collection, the Nicholas Roosevelt papers, you can find in Syracuse University in New York. It already tells you that it's at Syracuse University, that he was not a very, very important person. Otherwise, his paper would be at Yale or Harvard or Princeton. But it's a very nice collection, quite a few huge boxes, but the personal is very friendly. And then comes, the secondary sources, various newspapers because he was a newspaperman, so he was very prolific, not just his books that we mentioned, roughly a dozen books or so, but his newspaper articles as well. And he chronicled all throughout his 20s and 30s all those domestic and foreign events that he thought was important or he wanted to criticize, and he almost always found something to criticize because he thought his opinion or ideas were much better than anybody else's, at least most of the time.
Professor Glantz.
Thank you. First, words of congratulations, Oli, honestly. We are very proud of you, and thanks for doing this book too. And I'm saying this because this is the third now, because he has written about Jeremiah Smith and Hungary's financial stabilization. He's written about Royal Tyler in both English and Hungarian. So he's actually dealing with Americans that dealt with Hungary between the wars. And this is something that Hungarian history writing was not paying a hell of a lot of attention for political reasons, which meant that we lost basically like 50 years of history writing on this. So what Zoli is doing is pioneering work. This is different, though, than the other two books, isn't it? Because, as Balázs said, this is an intellectual history of the guy. Whereas with people like Royal Tyler, who's kind of a legendary figure in international politics, with Jeremiah Smith and Hungary's financial stabilization, those are like key historical events or issues that you have to deal with. And here, with Roosevelt, it's kind of strange because he's sort of just sort of poked his nose into some events, right? Like 1919, he was here with the Coolidge mission, then he returned as minister, but then there were all sorts of rumors about what happened in the Philippines, and we celebrated together the 200th birthday of George Washington when he was here, so we gave a speech. So it was like, you can't write a book like the ones you wrote about Smith and Tyler, so I'm glad you sort of went after the guy and his sort of intellectual exercises in trying to comprehend the universe that surrounds him. And of course my question is the issue that we keep arguing with Evie, who cannot be here, a colleague of ours, is like, does he write about Hungary condescendingly or not? Because this is a bone of contention that we have ever since we got hold of a front row seat, which is the iconic political memoir. My impression was that the way he writes about Lehár and others is fairly condescending. I mean, he came from basically a New York aristocratic family, seeing even Budapest, that's nowhere near New York in terms of, even New York of the 1910s, in terms of culture. It's not a European capital, it's a wannabe European capital. It wants to be like Paris or Vienna or something like that. So I had the impression, but Evie keeps arguing that it's not. What do you think of this, Zoli?
Okay, thank you for your congratulations and words. And of course, I'm not alone in this league because you're just another great champion of this cause. Yes, this condescension was typical of Roosevelt, and not just of Roosevelt, I think, but we have to make a distinction because when you, for example, when you hear his speech, when it's the 200th anniversary of Washington's birthday, or July 4th speech in Hungary, in the capital, he knew what to say. He knew what was expected of him as a representative of the United States, which was the hope for many Hungarians during the interwar years. But especially when you read his diary entries or personal letters, that's when you get closer to the man and how the man's mind was working. And that, as a Hungarian, not always very pleasant to read, though it's understandable from a certain point of view. Again, he came from this aristocratic or upper middle class, or between the two spheres in the United States. And I think that's why it's interesting and important to read his honest words when he was writing to himself, because I think through these words we can sort of comprehend a larger worldview of Americans who belong to this upper class or upper middle class or so-called, social aristocrats on the Eastern Coast. And it's not baffling, but it's sobering to understand how these people thought about this country and many other countries in the region, whether it was, the Czechs or the Poles or the Yugoslavs south of us. They never really appreciated, I think, Hungarian culture to an extent that perhaps it was due. They were fascinated by certain features of Hungarian cultures and certain people. We just heard Teleki, right? Was a very good representative of this because his intellectual powers and the way he was able to communicate to Roosevelt when he was here in 1919, that was a long-lasting effect on Roosevelt, regardless of the fact that Teleki was basically feeding him very good propaganda. But anyway, he learned a lot of facts, or he thought was facts from him, and he had him in high regard. So there were certain persons that he thought very well of in Hungary. But again, Hungarians, whether it was Horthy, leader, whether it was Bethlen, which is again surprising because Bethlen was typically thought of as a very outstanding politician, very astute man. And Roosevelt, when he arrived back in 1930 to his country, when the Great Depression really started to set in, and Bethlen was just losing his grip on the premiership and on this whole economic collapse, probably that tainted his picture about Bethlen, and he came up with quite a negative understanding or analysis of Bethlen, unfortunately. There was another thing you mentioned I wanted to respond. I'm not sure what...
Which one? That it's a different kind of book than the others, so I like it. But the condescension part. But if I may have a question, how do you evaluate him as a diplomat? Because this is a time when Americans go out into the world. Wilson's diplomats had absolutely no diplomatic training at all. I mean, any one of us could have been a diplomat under Woodrow Wilson. 2 of his ambassadors were his book publishers, in London and Rome. So, I mean, there was no diplomatic training at that point in time. So these people basically learned on the fly. So how do you evaluate Roosevelt as a diplomat?
Okay, so Roosevelt
And again, sorry, not looking back on it now, but as a diplomat of his own time, with the training he could have had or the experiences.
So it's important to understand that he had some training in diplomacy, not just because he was part of the Coolidge mission and he was in Central Europe in 1919 and he knew the place fairly well, but he also in 1916 and 17 he was secretary to the American ambassador to Paris. So he had some taste of diplomacy. He spoke fluent French and German, which was very helpful in Hungary, as you can imagine, in the early 1930s, because English was just for a few aristocrats. More people spoke German and French than English, let's just put it this way. So he could communicate it through. He had an open mind, that's important when it comes to diplomacy, and the secretaries of the embassy really helped him out, or the legation, rather, it was not an embassy yet, and he gave himself the first 2 months, so to speak, to break in, which I think he did successfully, relying on especially these other people and his communicative abilities. And he went out in Hungary, so he visited certain places. And if you read his reports, you can say they were good. And the State Department encouraged him to delve into economic and financial issues, especially because of the Great Depression was raging on. And his reports were very well known among the State Department circles, and he got feedback from various people throughout the years that, highlighting that those reports were talked of as the best, which is, of course, an overstatement, obviously, but they really, when it came to economic and financial woes or troubles, he really went to the root. He had an understanding of finances and economies. But it's also important to mention that the reason why he came or became minister to Hungary was a diplomatic blunder, because he had published a book on the Philippines in 1926, which was, again, very condescending, because it's another peripheral people, Southeast Asia. And Herbert Hoover, whom he knew back from the Paris Peace Conference days, nominated him to the Philippines as a vice governor, which he very much looked forward to, because his ambition was to become a governor in the end of the Philippines. But because of that book, the Filipinos were so angry that there were public book burnings, for example, of his book. So he was not very welcome on the islands, to say the least. And as a face-saving effect, basically, he was sent to Hungary. Not that he wanted to come to Hungary, but his earlier expertise on Hungary, because of 1919, just came in handy to explain away why he was sent and picked up this diplomatic post. But back to the question and the answer, I think he held himself pretty well up, despite the fact that he didn't go through now we think of the traditional diplomatic training. So he was a very smart person. I mean, we have to give it to him, credit goes. And he used very well his both ambition, energy, and knowledge. But it's also very important that this ministership, which lasted roughly 3 years, was to be just a step to a higher position. Especially the League of Nations would have been his, if not a dream, because that's too much to say, by the financial committee, sitting in Geneva, Switzerland, because that would have been, as he put it, a very prestigious post. Because if he had gone to Bulgaria, because there was an opening in Bulgaria for the League of Nations, that would have been another place that nobody reads or hears about in the United States. He wanted a spot that light shines on, and people in the United States would be aware of his activities. But that just didn't turn out the way he hoped to be, because when Franklin Roosevelt was elected, the Democrats basically swept the diplomatic post as well, so he had to retire and going back to journalism.
If I could just make a point that you've both made in your book, and I think in your remarks, you made the point that Hungarians and Central Europeans, particularly Hungarians, in those years, interwar years, they were very hopeful of a creative approach from the United States into the affairs of the region. Looking back, was that in every way justified? When you look at the impact of American diplomacy, was it at all substantial in those years until, let us say, the outbreak of war?
Well, the short answer would be no, and the longer, not really. This is what our colleague Eva, what I call the mirage. So in the interwar years, you can make an argument that Hungarians, the political circles, and the people at large had this, pipe dream of the United States coming to help. There was a Treaty of Trianon in 1920, which detached huge territories and large swaths of Hungarians, and revision was, the Nem Nem Soha slogan, probably many of you are aware of it, and they hoped, beyond hope, that the United States would come in and would help rectify these unjust borders, as, of course, the Hungarians saw it. Nothing even close happened, of course. But every single American coming here, whether in an official capacity like Roosevelt, or people in private capacity or not in an official capacity concerning American government, but through the League of Nations offices, or just MacArthur, no matter who came, they thought like, now here's another hope, you're our only hope. So, but it never lived up to anything. So it was just a dream, a pipe dream.
I would like to speak a little bit about this duplicity, in a way, between his diaries, his public speeches. You've mentioned this gap between. In his public speeches, Roosevelt is very friendly, very warm about Hungarians, about the Hungarians' role in Central Europe and so on. And he's, so to say, very critical in his diaries. And in a very finely written analysis, you show that in his autobiography, written at the beginning of the 50s, there is slightly different explanation than in his writings or in his private diaries. What is the cause of this gap, this difference between the two positions? And of course, we are Hungarians. So my question is: was he a friend of Hungary after leaving Budapest? We know that he kept two pulleys, two sheepdogs from Budapest. That was the two first pulleys in the United States. I guess he brought with him. So, but was he, after leaving Budapest, was he a friend of Hungary, member of the Hungarian lobby? Because reading your book, having read your books, I have some doubts about it. So he's maybe trying to have to keep his distances with Hungary and Budapest. Of course, member of the committee of the Hungarian Quarterly and so on. But in his public speeches or in his writings, he's more reluctant. I think that was my impression. Is it false or true? Or?
No, it's very close to what I discovered, because obviously, when you have a public speech and you know your audience and you are aware of the expectations, you choose your words accordingly and very wisely, and that's what he did. Not just in Budapest, but even back in the United States, I think in 46 in Cleveland, when there was a very large Hungarian community, and he was invited to open a garden. And again, he spoke like the greatest friend of Hungary, and he said, "I'm sorry, I'm not a Hungarian." That kind of speech, you can imagine how it went. It was very well welcomed by the people there. But I think we know exactly what he thought in the diaries, or that's much closer to what he really thought. Like in the case of anyone here, when you talk to someone openly in a public sphere, probably you have second thoughts many times. When you're on your page and you're writing down your fresh impressions about certain people or certain events, I think you are more honest. And that's what happened in this case. But that also plays into why the autobiography called Front Row Seat, which came out in 1953, is so different from the original at certain places. And I think the reason for this is one that in order to be publishable, you need to be careful what kind of language you use. So this kind of condescension that he used many times on the pages of the diary wouldn't have, lived to be published on the one hand. Plus, 30 years had gone by, so he reanalyze or reassess certain events that he
perhaps the Cold War context?
Maybe the Cold War context might have played in it. I didn't realize it was that important, so I don't think that played an image. I think what he changed in many ways was that he highlighted certain persons or certain events that he thought, and I think he was right, that American readers would be more interested in. And that's to our detriment. I mean, Hungarian researchers...
So that's the place of Franz Lehár and...
Yes, for example. He mentions them as well, or writes about them, but he writes about many other people in detail that is almost totally left out, or it's just shortened to a very short space. But Lehár is all there for pages and pages and pages, or Mussolini, and the other famous people who had become famous in the meantime. And since, Bethlen or Gömbös, I mean, or even Teleki didn't, unfortunately, deserve as many pages, unfortunately. That's why we have to read the two stuff together in order to get the picture.
He resigns when his other cousin becomes president because he's a Democrat and NR is a Republican. He goes back into journalism, and then the war. Now he's in the Office of War Information, so he's obviously not a free agent in any sense. But what are his attitudes at that point to the attempts by the Hungarians, obviously, to surrender to the Allies rather than to the Soviet Union, which was a kind of obsessive question in the minds of Hungarians in the war? I mean, he's no longer a diplomat. He no longer has a platform because he's in intelligence, actually. So, how do you describe his views then?
Well, he never really mentions Hungarians during the war, really. And when he was in the Office of War Information, that was propaganda service for domestic purposes. That's important, not in foreign affairs, not in OSS or anything. And he wanted to serve. That's important, probably, or partly because he felt himself more important not to serve, regardless that Franklin Roosevelt was a president whom he had criticized since 1930 on, even if he held him in very high esteem, especially when it came to foreign policy. But he was not aware of Hungarian foreign policy in that detail, and I didn't come across any letters or any diary entries that would deal with this topic. So unfortunately, we don't know what he really thought about it.
It's interesting because obviously, from the Hungarian side, that was the single most important question that Hungarians had to deal with in foreign policy in those years, and Hungarian diplomacy was very active. As we know, from Istanbul to Sweden and I think to Switzerland too.
But also his being in the United States played against the possibility of taking any serious part in this as well.
Yes. Well,
I'm actually checking out the Washington legation materials, and he's not even mentioned in like the late Pellény or Gika materials. He's not even mentioned. So they didn't even seek him out. That sort of answers Balázs's question. I think that he saw his diplomatic tour in Hungary as a sort of a one-off thing. Very much like when Nixon was sent to the Hungarian border in 1956 to look at the refugee situation. He returned home and said, okay, you deal with this from now on, I'm done. I did what I was asked to do. And that's it. I've had this impression with Roosevelt. But I do have another question. This may be of interest to the audience. The initial diary, the 1919 diary, has like 3 or 4 versions because he kept editing it. What do you think about this? And just for those of you who are Hungarian, Zoli did the Hungarian edition, a translation of the 1919 diary of Roosevelt. Which was, again, part of the Coolidge mission, Hungarian Soviet Republic stuff and things like that. And we did talk about this then, but maybe you want to share some of it with these people too, because that's fascinating. I mean, he kept rewriting his own stuff.
Yeah, it's very hard to exactly know why he did it. I can surmise certain things.
Probably preparing for publication, but he didn't find a publisher.
He wanted to have it published. I mean, the diaries that he wrote in 1919 when he was with the Coolidge mission in Romania and Hungary. And the way he did it typically is that he wrote newer version of narration, then he used the supposedly original diary entries. And I think he wanted it to be published in 1920 as much as it can be ascertained. the problem with this approach, I think that his name, despite his family name, he was not really not a well-known, not even a known diplomat at that time. And in 1919 and 1920, a score of books came out from highly regarded sources, like Harold Nicholson that we mentioned, for example. And I think the market was just depleted with this book. So yet another book, especially concentrating on Eastern Europe, wouldn't have had a very large market in the United States. That was my impression. But he kept trying, and I think since he was unsuccessful, that's why he realized, perhaps to a certain degree, that he had to rewrite certain passages, like in the autobiography in 1953, not just the 30 years difference, but he understood in order to be more marketable, you had to change the narrative to a certain degree and the highlights. And by the way, I mean, if you look at the original entries, you will see that nobody would have published them, I believe, even in 1920. He used such a harsh language in the diaries, though it's very entertaining, I have to say. And I recommend you read it if you can. But it's not something that, the print could take. It was, if you say condescending, you have to take it to a whole different level too.
Yeah, I mean, anti-Semitic remarks, ethnocentric remarks and stuff like that. Anglo-Saxon superiority narratives and stuff like that. And this is an interesting thing about Nicholas Roosevelt and connects to what you also mentioned, that he continued to, judged based upon what you say, he continued to exist in this old school race mentality that we published about, that there was the Anglo-Saxon race as like the most advanced one, and then you have the lesser nations. And Hungary clearly fell into this category. But if you look at the word like that, you are not giving a fair chance to the country you're in from the very first moment. But again, from an American point of view, why would he?
Well, shouldn't we look a moment at the social class from which he comes and its record from where you begin the book, really, the 1912 Republican Convention, right the way into the point of his death. That social class is extremely powerful in foreign policy, much more so than it is in domestic policy, because they're more interested. And then, of course, it has enormous, you might say it has considerable blindnesses and short-sightedness in the interwar years. But then during and after the war, that's the social class that really creates the institutions. I'm thinking of the institutions of Western defense against the Soviet Union. It's an extraordinary. It helps to revive Germany. It establishes an ally in Japan after the war. Its actions, from the Marshall Plan to the creation of GATT and other institutions, it creates the institutions which at the moment are now under stress, but which have performed very, very well. So, first of all, this is a limited class. It's anti-Semitic, although it then yields power in America from let's say the 60s onwards. All the institutions it's created and which it's dominated, the law, Congress and so on, they not only expand, but they expand in such a way, for example, that Jewish Americans play a much bigger role. In some respects, they're the inheritors, at least the first inheritors of that class's superiority. But that class itself was divided, and he's an example, isn't he, of one half of the class, because there are significant, or are there significant differences between Nicholas Roosevelt's Republicans and subsequently the people who in the second Roosevelt administration, and more importantly, in a way, the Truman administration, who do this amazing creativity. Perhaps I'll begin with you, Professor Glantz.
It's difficult to say because there is a party difference here too. That Republican could not come out in support of Wilsonian internationalism at any point in time. So one question towards Oli from me would be like, how much of a Wilsonian internationalist was he? Was he more of a traditional like let's select the issues we want to deal with because we are separated by the ocean from the rest of the world and just cherry pick the ones that we look good on, like Theodore Roosevelt, or was he, or what's your impression, was he more into integration?
Okay. I think since he was brought up basically by Theodore Roosevelt, that was the intellectual school that he inherited, and he couldn't really shed this. He didn't really want to, I believe. And concerning Europe, and that was typically, you said, half-half, I think many of these American leaders or the upper class just looked at Europe and saw what a mess it was and caused to the United States, again, through this reading. And I don't realize, or I never came across something that he really wanted to embrace this, Atlantic world to a large degree. Of course, Second World War would change everything, not just almost, but basically everything. And I think that was partly the lesson learned after First World War. That's why the Roosevelt administration, then the Truman administration became the Cold Warrior nation, and the others growing up on it. And it's also very interesting, just going back to this anti-Semitic remark that you mentioned, that if you read the autobiography, you would never believe that this guy didn't like the Jews. If you read the originals, you would think he hates them. And that would be the right impression. But again, when he realized that you just can't sell this, he changed the tone. Sometimes he changed the content. So just to hide this streak, because after 45, of course, it was not permissible to speak of the Jewish people in any negative way, obviously.
But Zoli, is this pretense, or was he shocked by the Holocaust? I mean, let's be fair to him. I don't know how you feel about this, but it's very difficult to think about Jews in the old, like pre-World War I Anglo-Saxon way after what happened in the Holocaust. After basically everybody got compromised on that, including the Red Cross and things like that.
It would be great to see from first hand, so I never saw...
It would have been so nice to talk to him, right?
Yes. I never saw any evidence about his changed worldview, so I don't think he did. But probably it colored his worldview as well. I mean, the Holocaust and the tragic World War II probably changed some of his views to a certain degree, at least in a sense that he wanted to know those days behind him, at least publicly. Whether inside what he felt, that's a different story.
Sorry.
Just one question. His stay in Budapest, for him, I think, was an adventure in under many aspects, because he was short of money a lot of time. He was writing to his mother that the money is lacking, and I need more money, because he was a political envoy in a way at his post in Budapest. So perhaps his memoirs of Budapest or his memoirs of Budapest were not very good enough. But on the other hand, I've got the impression that, and you wrote it, this is a man who is very firmly following his own convictions. He's convinced that he's always right, in a way. And in certain moments, I think especially during the Second World War or in 38, 39, often he's wrong in the 20s and in the 30s and condescending and so on. But this firm conviction of I see the things and that's the good way. In 38, 39, or during the war, this sharp standing is often justified in a way, I guess. So he is right in this moment, and with the same attitude in the 20s, he was sometimes wrong or making waves like in the Philippines.
So, of course, nobody's right all the time, not even Nicholas Roosevelt, even if he believed he was. And you can read again and again in his letters, private letters, that I always was so right when it was 1916. I knew what was going to happen. I was so right in 19 and so on. So he always self-justifies what he said. I knew that the Hungarian government was going to do it. I was the first to tell the State Department and so on. So it's always self-justification most of the time. probably, even if he wasn't right, and he wasn't right all the time, I think he could live with it, and he just, let it go, and he started another prediction that must turn right and true over time.
Well, let me just try to wrap up this particular bit of the discussion by this question. Would I be right to see Nicholas Roosevelt and people, the Democrats like Dean Acheson, and all the way to Dean Rusk too, as essentially very similar because they're in the same social class, they have the same self-confidence, they have the same network of contacts, obligations, and so. Or should I think of them as being really very different and separated by two things: political partisanship on the one hand, but secondly, a completely changed outlook of that social class, or significantly changed outlook of that social class as a result of the Second World War. And I'm not just thinking of the Holocaust and the changed attitude that everybody absolutely had to take towards anti-Semitism following it, but I'm thinking more generally of attitudes to the rest of the world and to social policy and reform.
I think Nicholas Roosevelt was limited to a large degree when it came to the international events, despite the fact that he was really a smart person, but he was blinded by his upbringing. I mean, that progressive ideas that Theodore Roosevelt passed on were really good in the first 2 decades, perhaps, of the 1920s, but they outlived their usefulness in the 30s, especially the 40s. And I think Nicholas Roosevelt just couldn't really keep pace with the times. He thought if I was right 20 years ago, and I was, he thought, I'm right again. And I think Dean Acheson and his company could see the big game much clearer, and that's how the creation, as I called it, came into being. But I want to mention just one thing again concerning Hungarians. We mentioned the condescending, but when it came to certain persons, he was willing to go far. When there was an employee of the Hungarian legation who didn't find a job, he kept writing letters, and he didn't leave the topic there to rest, and he criticized, for example, Dean Acheson to a large degree that person doesn't do anything. I asked, not that he should have, but I'm Nicholas Roosevelt, so how come? And he tried to help. So if there were a few people who had proved in his eyes that they were worthy, he went out on a limb for them.
Now, I'm sure you all saw this coming, but if we think of the last kind of WASP president, isn't it JFK? Because although he's actually not a Protestant, he is very much somebody who thinks of himself, I think, and the family do, as being the heirs of that tradition. And of course, he shows this at the beginning of the war in Vietnam. And now, are we right? Well, the wheel turns. Things happen, go in a certain direction. The policy that worked yesterday seems to fail today and doesn't look promising for tomorrow. Are we living through the period in which the people who won that kind of ideological, philosophical, social battle in the Cold War are now losing it to the same kind of people who back in the 30s would have warned against American overconfidence, over-expansion, and so on and so forth?
It seems to be a recurrent trend in American foreign policy that you have the internationalist and the isolationist drive. Going back to the original question, I think Dean Acheson and company were in a different league than Nicholas Roosevelt in terms of intellectual potential, not just in performance in government, regardless how you evaluate the Truman administration. But Nicholas Roosevelt was a well-read man, wasn't he? Educated, he wrote well, but he probably had pretensions of greatness rather than actually being able to achieve it. And again, the very fact that the Cold War was set up by democratic administrations basically ruled him out. And then, as Zoli explained, he had health issues, so he was basically marginalized. But even by the time with Eisenhower, the Republicans came back. And I mean, Eisenhower is the last Republican president who was not a Nazi or Hitler, as you know, from your own country. I mean, ironically, so although he's the most likable Republican for the mainstream and the legacy media. But even with him, Roosevelt was a non-player. I tend to agree with what Zoli said, and I'm glad you said it specifically, that he saw things, and then he thought 20 years later that they were the same. Now, Hungary in 1919 was very different than in Hungary in 1933, and Hungary in 1953 was very, very, very different than Hungary in 1919. So he had to go for the name recognition of stories that he told, and that's why we have Lehár, and whether he could play the piano properly or not. I mean, the last thing you want to read in an American diplomat's memoir is how well Lehár played the piano, right? That's what you say. Okay, I do have a pencil mark in my copy with an improper comment. WTF, right? I mean, honestly, like, really? I mean, we're talking about 1919 in Hungary, Lehár, White Terror, stuff like that, and his chief concern is that he wasn't a particularly good pianist. I mean, Hungary was at war with basically everybody around Hungary. I don't think we had like proper pianos for white terrorists to play for American diplomats. I'm exaggerating this, but I mean that's the Nicholas Roosevelt I love, though, because he has these comments when you read it, what on earth is this, right? I mean, he tends to be very entertaining as a writer. But I tend to agree, even like the reworked versions of the diary are fundamentally different. I'm sorry.
Well, and not very good as a colonial official either.
But it's important that he had musical upbringing as well. So he played the cello and trios in Hungary with other diplomats. He learned this from his mother, who came, with a French lineage. So, which again shows on the one hand that he had a very wide spectrum of knowledge, not just well educated in every sense of the word, but perhaps because of this he thought that he was better than others, which he couldn't really share.
There's a little more to this, though, to be fair to Nicholas Roosevelt, and I don't want to be fair to him after this comment, but I don't give a damn how Lehár played the piano. But one of the things that restarted Hungarian cultural life after the war, as early as 1920-21, were opera performances in the opera of classical music and stuff like that. And the diplomatic corps attended that regularly.
So it was very chic at the time to have his own lodge in the opera. So different embassies and legations had their own
so this
place.
This was a cultural event. This was a symbol that Hungary was of high culture, or Hungary was capable of enjoying high culture. And one of the first things that Hungary restarted right after the war, when half of the country was still occupied by Romania, was like opera performances. So I understand the musical part, but that's one of my favorite parts.
But even in the mid-20s, when the Tylers were here and the opera came to mind, and they said, well, Vienna is not that far.
Again, can you argue with that?
Well, let me then take us back to the time he was here. And it seems to me that this is such an important time in European history, not simply in Hungarian history, that did he have, in your view, any really important insights that other people didn't have about the developing situation in Europe while he was here? I mean, after all, what you've got is a depression. You've got the rise of extremism. You've got all the continuing conflicts between the countries in the region. You've got the little entente backed by France and so on. Are there things you would point to as being, he may not have been, and you do obviously feel this, he may not have been the top class. He's not up there with Dean Acheson and people like that. but nonetheless, he's an intelligent, fundamentally civilized man. And so what does he see there, in your view, that really mark him out as someone interesting?
I think he was really right, and as I mentioned earlier, when it came to economic and financial issues, which he has studied, and he was most of the time spot on. During the Depression, and again, that's an influence that probably very few people could, close off. He was also depressed to a certain degree. He had self-doubt for a few weeks, which was really amazing. And so when he was writing about that stuff, or when he met people who were close to financial policies or economic policies, I think his reports were really valuable. But for example, when he met Mussolini, he wrote, "That man is a genius."
Unfortunately, other people, Churchill himself at some point said similar things. When you have a time of complete chaos, well, it wasn't complete, but it was growing chaos, you're going to get very mistaken judgments. So it's, I wouldn't mark him down too badly at that point, particularly since Mussolini was someone whom France and Germany were wooing until the Abyssinian War, really.
He was Man of the Year for Time magazine. He was one of the darlings of Americans. But may I rephrase your question in a way to create a little conflict inside of Zoli? So who was the go-to guy, Royal Tyler or Nicholas Roosevelt when it came to Hungary in the early 1930s?
Royal Tyler.
So that's why you wrote about Tyler first. Okay,
so, because Royal Tyler, not everybody knows here, I was an American who lived in Hungary for 11 years during the interwar years, service in the League of Nations. And he knew Hungarians and Hungarian culture to a degree that probably no other American did in the 1920s and 30s. And I think if you compare his knowledge and assessment and analysis about Hungarians, you get a clearer picture. Not as entertaining, though.
He doesn't die until 82. And he's a writer, so he's still continuing to comment on events. And when you look at those final years of his, do you see somebody who's learnt a lot and who's seen things? You have mentioned how he changes his mind and somewhat disguises his previous opinions. What do you see in those years particularly?
In the retirement area? Not much. I think he became quite a frustrated man, partly to the health issues that he made him retire. His wife died fairly early on, so from the age of 60 or so, he was alone. That obviously didn't help his mental condition. And as a proof to this, he wrote cookbooks and environmental issues, which is another, I think, significant course change to the earlier volumes that he had produced.
It's actually a not uncommon one for Republicans to take, oddly. Because there's an element in the Republican Party which has always been very strongly environmentalist. Most of those organizations, we now think of left-wing or environmentalist organizations, were originally created by upper-class Americans who wanted green parks and national parks and so on. So that is it's interesting that he did uphold that progressive
and that, of
element.
course, came from Theodore Roosevelt as well,
yes,
in the first
exactly.
place.
Yeah, good.
For comparison, it seems to me that Nicholas Roosevelt could be compared to like Bullitt, maybe, William Bullitt. And there are multiple biographies of Bullitt which are like almost famous and so close to greatness type of stuff, so almost made it kind of guy. And Nicholas Roosevelt seems to be a character like that to me.
But I think he was destined to be second class between Theodore and Franklin. There was no way for him in the sun.
With a name like that, he didn't stand a chance.
I might go back to an earlier point, really, namely that you can be second class and third class and still be a good diarist. There are a number of diarists. I would say Chips Channon, for example. He was a naive. He wasn't exactly a Nazi or anything, but he was naively a naive appeaser and a naive supporter of King Edward VIII. But nonetheless, his diary is gripping and interesting, and highly entertaining. I think we are moving along to. Sorry? Oh, absolutely. So let me ask people from the floor what questions they would like to ask, and the lady here will have a microphone. Can we see? Raise your hand, please.
Thank you all for a very interesting discussion, and thank you, Zoltan, for what looks like going to be a great book. I haven't read it yet, obviously, but I did skim through the index and looked up Allen Dulles, and I see that there's several mentions of Dulles, who was the American spy master in the Second World War and before the Second World War, later head of the CIA. Did Nicholas have much involvement with the world of intelligence and Dulles's more shadowy activities?
Unfortunately not.
Oh, what? Nothing? Not at all?
Well, they knew him from the 1919 days, the Paris Peace Conference, and they were in touch on and off. But he was not that close to the fire. He would have loved that, I'm sure, but no, unfortunately not.
Okay.
Good.
Then the book would have been longer.
Yes, you'd have more to write about. Yeah.
Another question? Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. Very interesting talk. So you said about 2 times that he lived until 1982. So I was wondering what happened after 1956 when the Hungarian diaspora grew in the US and a lot of interesting activities happened back then. A lot of activism went on. Did he engage in that? Thank you.
No, he kept a very isolated presence in Big Sur, California, where he moved after he retired from journalism in New York, and once a week he went to buy supplies, and that was it. And through letters he were in contact with publishers and various newspapers, but to my knowledge, not with the Hungarian diaspora at all. The 2 dogs that you mentioned, the 2 pulleys, that
died very early after.
He wanted to create a large breeding farm because he believed, probably was right, the first 2 pulleys ever in the New World, but one of them died very soon after, and he had to give this up. So while he was on the East Coast in New York, he was relatively active with Hungarians, as I mentioned, the Cleveland issue, and in New York he was guest of honor at certain lunches and dinners, but as soon as he retired and moved to the West Coast, basically everything was cut off.
Another question? Yes, the gentleman down here.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a question for the author. I didn't read the book yet. It's not necessarily about him, but about Americans in general or Westerners. I have this sense that they tend to view Hungary through Germanic lenses. What do I mean? You mentioned that, well, Vienna is not that far. We know that after 1867, there was the Union. Do you think that he did that? So it's sort of Hungary, it's sort of a little colony from the Germanic world, or you would say that he saw it as something else? Thank you.
I think he thought of Hungary more of like a feudal or semi-feudal country, not in particularly close connection to Germany, in the case of Roosevelt. And he wasn't alone. If you read the various texts of other Hungarian ministers, Hungarian being here, they share this idea that these Hungarians were very cute but barbaric people.
Also, I mean, the upper house was restored, like latifondia were restored, Aponyi was found new estate in Hungary and stuff like that. So it's like, in a sense, Hungary was a recreation, a partial recreation of the pre-war order, interwar Hungary. So, and again, I mean, Americans had already criticized Hungary before the end of the war, and in terms of election laws and things like that. So, I mean, arguing that Hungary wasn't particularly democratic is not saying a hell of a lot. And of course, you had this tradition of feudal structures. It's like before the war, everybody wanted to talk to Aponyi, Andrássy, and Tisza. After the war, it was probably something like Horthy, Bethlen, and Teleki. right? So it's like they come in threes.
But to give another example, Joshua Butler Wright, who was a minister before because Roosevelt, and he was a professional diplomat, said, the thing about Hungary, that Hungarians would never have democracy because they don't deserve it.
I think we'd have to say that writers from Bram Stoker to Graham Greene and Eric Ambler also have a lot to answer for the impression of Hungary that has, and of the region as a whole, has been given over the years. But having said that, actually we do have a distinguished thriller writer in the audience who asked the question about Alan Dulles. Is the author of a trilogy of detectives, three novels in a thriller, in a trilogy about crime in Budapest, political crime in Budapest, extremely entertaining. Let me now see if there's any more questions? Gentleman here, gentleman there, and gentleman there. So we have three. So, okay.
Very briefly, so thank you for the panel. I had a question for Tibor Glant. You mentioned earlier that people like Petr Zoltán were pioneers so history writing made a comeback after it had essentially disappeared for 50 years. Could you give us a state of history writing in Hungary today? Briefly.
What a fair question. If I would listen to his professor, then we should be ashamed of ourselves. Some of our senior professors sometimes say they are quite unhappy with us, right? But I think there's a hell of a lot of very good history writing in Hungary. And why I like what Zoli is doing is because he's looking at people who don't fall into your traditional diplomatic, historical, European-style periodization of history. So when he wrote about, like in this case, but also in case of Royal Tyler, we are getting the whole arc of the story from his imagine a biography of Ellen Dulles that deals with the Swiss legation in 1917, the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, OSS, and then CIA in 1956. You're getting some of the story, but if Hungarians would write stories like that, we would omit considerable parts of Ellen Dulles' life. And in a sense, what Zoli is doing is he's trying to paint the entire arc of a career like this. And that's why I think very highly of his work. As for the interwar years, the communists didn't like it because they basically looked at anything that happened between the fall of the Hungarian Soviet Republic and the communist takeover, I think, in 1947 as a historical misunderstanding, as a dead-end street. And it was like hortifascism and American imperialists and stuff like that. Like there was a publication by the Hungarian Academy, the title of which was The Role of Americans in the Stabilization of Hortifascism. Oh, this is the title. The Role of American Imperialists in az amerikai imperialisták szerepe, a hortifasizmus, whatever, megerősítés vagy stabilizás, whatever. I mean, it's you're brain dead if you try to translate this into English. People wouldn't believe you. I have a quote that I always use in articles in English. The United States is a young predator. This is academic Hungarian from the 1950s. Okay. One issue that the communists had was that, and this is something I wrote recently about in Hungarian, but I promised to do this in English. When the Hungarian Soviet Republic collapsed, and the Horthy people came in, many of the communist leaders who they could lay their hands upon were arrested and incarcerated. And they were, well, beaten up in jail and abused and stuff like that, even before they went to trial. And the only two organizations that stood up to protect them were the Quakers and the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, for different reasons. These two came back to Hungary after the Second World War, and it was the very same communists who threw them out of the country whom they had protected in 1919 and 1920. This is not something that you can spin into alternative narratives. You write this out of history. You can't explain that the same Quaker is a fascist British imperialist agent who came to see Ágoston or even Rákosi in jail. You just can't spin it. So this is what Todorov talks about, how totalitarian regimes approach history and how they try to eradicate the past. And this is full eradication. And this is one of the reasons why this was basically written, forgotten, or sort of, you don't want to go there type of stuff. And this is the problem that Zoli mentioned, that it would have been so nice to ask Nicholas Roosevelt about some of this stuff.
Thank you. The question was addressed to all three of you, I think. Do you want to come in on this? Okay. You're happy with that reply. Good. Next question.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the presentation. This was a very lively and very interesting talk. I enjoyed it tremendously. Not having read the book, my question or sort of half methodological comment is more general, but maybe it may elicit something about Nicholas Roosevelt as well. We know that what is called in historiography as ego documents are very, very diverse, and they are constructed in the same way as any other piece of writing by any human. Of course, we usually rely on that more for some purposes, especially in the biography, than on public utterances and public speeches and that sort of thing. Nevertheless, these, specifically diaries, have very, very different motivations behind. Some people write diaries actually to pin down facts about their life. Some people write diaries to justify themselves. Some people write diaries to vent their frustrations on paper. Anybody who has ever been writing a diary and not Facebook comments on that, because that is public, so truly diaries for themselves, would know that once you start to read it a week after, you don't even recognize what you were thinking about at the time. So how much should or can we rely on these private documents, or what was the case in Nicholas Roosevelt's case?
That's a very exciting question, of course. And if you read Professor, I think, Bátony's recent book about this, You Come Closer to the Truth, I think, yes, it's absolutely true. I mean, maybe not a week, but a month later, you will you would rephrase some of the ideas you put on. Maybe that was one of the reasons why he kept re-editing sometimes the narrative, and sometimes changed, even at least the content if he didn't quote from the original diaries. Of course, they are not totally reliable sources. I wouldn't say that you always have to take with a grain of salt, but that's the window we have many times to these people's thinking, at least at that period, at that given day or time, and we have to use them as critically as possible. But you cannot say that just because this person wrote something either as a way of venting frustration or just. So I don't believe that if you write diary, you won't consciously distort the truth. I don't believe in that. Probably there are examples for this, but I don't think it was the case. So if you have the original and you can corroborate it with some perhaps other secondary facts, that you can rest assured that this is as close as you can get. Probably you have to analyze it. You have to be very careful. Obviously, it's a very thin ice, but I think they are tremendously useful, because they come from that private sphere that's the only way we can talk to these people. But I wonder what you think.
One additional comment on this is that Nicholas Roosevelt rewrote his 1919 diary like 3 times at least, right, from his original notes, even long before there was any chance of publication. So he kept chewing at it. And that's why this is a very good question. When I was torturing Zoli unofficially, I was asking him questions like, okay, which version did you choose for publication? because you lay it out, and sometimes the same day looks very different. And the commentary on people kind of looks different too. But that's a good question, but there's no way we can reconstruct it, because we don't even know the order in which they were created, right? Do you have the exact order of the versions of the 1919 diary, or just the versions? Because they were just bunched together in the same box in Syracuse, and it's like 1 or 2 boxes of typed documents, and then you have some handwritten notes on them. There's no way to trace the evolution of the text. which is a loss in a sense, because, but let's give the devil his due. He's a wonderful storyteller. So sometimes people write diaries because they enjoy telling stories too. You can't accuse Hugh Gibson of this, for example, from the same period, right? Or our friend Story, Richard Story, or whoever, the Yale guy who was with Roosevelt in Budapest. Story. You can't accuse him of being a good storyteller, but Roosevelt is a good storyteller. Yeah. He's a natural writer, and that's what makes him interesting. I tend to agree that there is a literary quality to this, in a way that sometimes, I mean, I'm sure you've seen something like Haig's memoirs. Your brain shuts off after page 2. I'm sorry. There are good memoirs, good diaries, and bad diaries, right? And then he could write an enjoyable one, and that's.
And just one more thing. One of the reasons why he re-edited or sometimes played with this, because I think when he put them down, he couldn't be sure, even if he had ambition, he couldn't be sure they would see the light of day. And it's very different from, for example, George Kennan, who knew exactly that his diaries was going to be read afterwards when he passed away. So in that sense, it's somewhere in between, but again, you never really know.
Before I ask for that,
just one question, one more comment. When Ben Holtz wrote his diary, he wrote his diary for Polk, who was the head of the American Peace Commission, and not for public consumption. And when there was revived interest in the early 30s of the First World War, right about the time that Roosevelt was here, that's when it was published. And this was something that Roosevelt had to be aware of. That you write your diary basically almost like in a friendly, sometimes colloquial manner, because you're writing it to for the benefit of one superior, to keep him posted on what's happening, and then it suddenly gets published. And that could be the reason, yes.
Before I ask the last question, can I just welcome the United States chargé d'affaires who has arrived at the back. Thank you.
I'm not a predator. but you feel young, right?
Yes, gentleman there.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. Did Roosevelt's condescension, did that extend to his fellow Americans that were in the South, or Jewish or Irish as well?
Not that I know of, I would say. When it was outside the United States, always looking down on them, basically, except if they were perhaps English. But other than that, yeah, so whether they were French, or Latins generally, or of course Asians or Latinos, no. Within the United States, I didn't come across any of such condescension just because somebody's, come from the South. So I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. Any more questions? Well, in that case, let me ask our three speakers, perhaps starting with you, to see if they have any final thoughts. And Professor Glantz?
Sorry. My only final thought is to announce, because Zoli hasn't done it yet, that he has actually completed a manuscript in Hungarian on American diplomats who served in Hungary between the wars. And we hope to be publishing it soon, right? So there is more to be read about these people. But congratulations, Zoli, again. We are very happy for you.
Thank you for this book, first of all. And I think it is important, if we consider it not a book of intellectual history, but a book of diplomatic history, which is not, but for a while, that's in a kind of a new diplomatic history in a way, because this kind of historical approach needs a profound knowledge of the people who are making the diplomacy. So it's their sociology, their backgrounds, their family and intellectual background that was the reason why it was fascinating for me, and I learned a lot. So thank you.
I just, my appreciation to these nice words and to the large audience that we have here. If I had known all these questions before I wrote the book, I would have done it somewhat differently, I guess, and it would have been even better. But, we are in strange days, and the world economy is in not shadows, but in bad conditions. So if you can change it or want to change it, 3 words like in the movie: buy this book.
Well, I want to say in response that the book is about a middling person of a social class, which, when at the end of the day, won the Second World War, created the institutions of the West that won the Cold War, and then, having established America as the preeminent force in the world, it applied to other people in the society. It gave them the opportunities and obeyed the rules that had made itself great, but then allowed them to take over. They quietly ushered themselves into the wings of history. I don't think there are many cases of that in history, and I think we should, in a sense, celebrate them. It's interesting to have, very interesting to have the reflections and thoughts of a man who wasn't the most impressive member of that class, but nonetheless was a clever writer and has given us an inside portrait, which I think is what writers and journalists are supposed to do. And thank you very much indeed, and thank you for this interesting discussion.